Most people don't know about the ICD, the Integrated Contamination Division, and that's exactly how they like it. They've been around forever, quietly cleaning up the world's loose ends, the things that don't make sense, that don't belong. They're scooped up, locked away, and forgotten. Officially, the ICD handles biological hazards and experimental preservation. Unofficially, they're in the business of making the impossible disappear. I worked for them long enough to know better than to ask questions. Facility 112 wasn't my first assignment, but it was the last. Places like that aren't for the curious. It's a simple job, a good fit for someone like me. I was used to it. You don't work for the ICD without learning to accept the strange. You hear things, rumors of living shadows, creatures with too many teeth, things that vanish if you look directly at them. You don't get attached, you don't wonder, and you definitely don't ask what's in the sealed containment pods. You just keep your head down and follow the rules. The facility is tucked away where no one would think to look. It's not glamorous, and it's where they send the most dangerous and valuable finds. My job was to keep people out and things in. I'm not a scientist or an analyst, just one of the guards who patrols the halls, checks badges, and watches security feeds. The day they brought it in, the whole place felt wrong. Facility 112 was usually quiet, sterile almost, but that day there was this heavy tension in the air, like everyone was waiting for something bad to happen. I was stationed at one of the checkpoints when the transport team rolled through. 8 people in hazmat suits wheeled in a massive containment pod, and no one was talking. It wasn't the usual protocol. It was fear. Even the scientists, who normally treated these things like interesting puzzles, looked like they'd rather be somewhere else. I wasn't supposed to see it. My job was to check their clearance, make sure the path to Containment Wing C was clear and move on. But I lingered just for a moment, and when they opened the pod, I saw it. After that, I couldn't stop staring. The thing was enormous, at least 12 feet tall, its wings folded against its body like dark, shimmering curtains. The surface caught the light in strange ways, shifting like oil on water. Its body was covered in thick, dark fuzz, almost soft-looking. But its eyes were alive. Black, unblinking, and endless, like staring into a void that stared back. The moth didn't move, not once, not even when they locked it in the chamber. I hated looking at it. The longer you stared, the heavier it felt, like the air around it was pressing down on your chest. It was beautiful, but not in a way you could admire. It was the kind of beauty that made your stomach twist, that lit up some deep instinct in your gut telling you this thing wasn't right, that it wasn't supposed to exist. I told myself it was just another anomaly. That was the only way to get through it. You pretend these things don't matter, that they're just part of the job. But the moth wasn't like the others. You could feel it, even from a distance, like it was waiting for something. You weren't supposed to care about the things they brought in. That was rule number 1. But the moth made that impossible. I couldn't stop thinking about it, even when I wasn't on shift. It wasn't just the size of those unblinking eyes. It was the way the air felt heavier around it, the way it seemed so perfectly still but alive at the same time. I'd seen plenty of weird things come through Facility 112. But this was different. It wasn't just contained. It felt like the moth was letting us hold it, like it wanted to be there. It started to bother me more than it should have. On patrol, I passed by Containment Wing C, glancing toward the reinforced doors like I was expecting something. A shift in the air, a sound, anything. The moth never moved, but its presence was constant, oppressive. I couldn't stop myself from wondering where it had come from, how the ICD had managed to capture something so alien, so massive. Curiosity got the better of me, and I broke my own rule. I asked questions. It wasn't a big direct interrogation, just quiet conversations off the record when no one else was around. I started with the other guards, guys I knew wouldn't report me. Most of them shrugged it off, muttering things like bigwig orders and above my pay grade. But then I got lucky. Henderson, one of the transport team members, was still stationed on site. He'd been part of the group that brought the moth in. He wasn't supposed to talk about it, but he liked the sound of his own voice. "You really want to know?" he asked one night, leaning in conspiratorially during our shared break. His voice was low, and the hum of the vending machines was the only other sound in the room. "This one's a special case. Came from deep in the Appalachia, hillbilly country. You wouldn't believe the mess they found it in." He didn't wait for me to answer before launching in. Henderson never needed encouragement. "Couple of hillbillies caught it," he said, smirking like the whole thing was a joke. "They found it just sitting there in the middle of the night in their barn. Can you believe that? As big as it is, just perched there, wings all folded up. Didn't move a muscle. They thought he was some kind of demon. Chained it up and threw a tarp over it. Didn't even fight back." I frowned. "It didn't move at all?" "Not once," he said. "Not when they tied it up, not when they started poking it with sticks. They were trying to see if it was alive, you know. Even when we got there, it just sat there. The locals didn't know what to do with it, claimed it was some kind of omen, said it showed up after the livestock started getting bigger." I hesitated. Bigger how? Faster, stronger, muscles bulging. The farmers thought it was the feed or something until the horses started disappearing. Then the family started acting weird. Didn't want to leave the barn, wouldn't eat anything that didn't come from the farm. By the time we got there, they were half feral, dragging raw meat into the barn in the middle of the night. The words stuck in my throat. "And the moth, it just let you take it?" "Folded its wings up real neat, like it was helping," Henderson said, shrugging like it was no big deal. "Didn't resist, didn't make a sound. Weirdest damn thing I've ever seen." He said it so casually, but his words churned in my head long after. Creatures brought to Facility 112 were usually terrified or aggressive. I'd seen things thrash in containment pods and heard them screech and wail as the ICD's handlers wrestled them into their new cages. But this was different. The moth hadn't been captured. It had let itself be taken. Why? "And the family?" I asked after a long pause. Henderson's smirk faded, his tone shifting like he realized he'd already said too much. "Scrambled," he said quietly, tapping his temple. "Wiped clean, like everyone else in that town. They didn't remember a thing, just thought the horses got spooked and bolted. No harm done. Typical ICD work." "But," I started, but he cut me off with a sharp shake of his head. "Look, man, you're better off not knowing the rest. They handled it, okay? The locals, the farm, all of it. His gaze darted toward the door, as if someone might be listening. Forget I said anything. He stood up, brushing imaginary crumbs off his pants, and left the break room without another word. For a moment, I sat there in silence, staring at the empty chair he'd left behind. I wanted to stop thinking about it. I wanted to convince myself he was exaggerating, or at least that it wasn't my problem. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't shake the image of a 12-foot creature calmly folding its wings, letting itself be captured. There was something wrong about that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those black, endless eyes staring back at me, unblinking, like they already knew how this would end. Facility 112 always had this sterile, chemical tang in the air, like bleach and burnt circuits. You got used to it after a while, to the point where you didn't even notice it anymore. But lately, there was something else, faint but persistent. A metallic edge, sharp and clean, like the coppery taste you get when you accidentally bite the inside of your mouth hard enough for it to bleed. It hung heavier in the corridors near Containment Wing C, subtle enough to ignore it if you tried. But it was there. People noticed it. I could see it in how they paused for just a second too long, nose twitching, glancing around like they couldn't place it. Then they'd shake it off, keep walking, keep pretending. Many of us had been at Facility 112 for years, and you don't last that long without learning how to pretend. But pretending only worked for so long. I noticed other things too. Subtle at first, but impossible to ignore once you knew what to look for. Wilson was the first. He wasn't exactly subtle. He'd always been a loud guy, the kind of person who filled the silence with stories about his kids or the lake he was building a dock for. But over the past week, something about him had shifted. It wasn't like he'd stopped talking. It was how he spoke. His voice was steadier, more deliberate, like he'd stripped out every unnecessary word. It wasn't natural. It was efficient. And it wasn't just his voice. One day, I caught him hauling a crate of equipment that usually took 2 people. He carried it like it weighed nothing. When I pointed it out, he gave me this tight smile, but there was something about the way he looked at me, like I was the one being weird. "Feeling good lately," was all he said, before setting the crate down with a soft thud and walking off, his stride smooth, almost too smooth. Then there was Ramirez. She was sharp, always had been, but lately her sharpness had taken on a different edge. She moved faster, quieter, like she'd been practicing. I caught her during a patrol, walking the corridor outside Containment Wing C. Normally, you'd hear her boots echo against the concrete, but this time, I didn't hear her until she was right in front of me. She nodded as she passed, and I nodded back. But there was this brief moment when her eyes met mine. It wasn't a look exactly. It was more like she was assessing me. Even Henderson, the guy who never stopped talking, wasn't the same. He still ran his mouth, but there was an intensity to him now, a coiled energy that hadn't been there before. When he spoke, he leaned in too close, his words clipped and precise, like he was trying to convince you of something without outright saying it. And then there was me. I felt it too. Not in the same way, not yet, but enough to make me uneasy. Every time I passed by the observation window, I'd catch myself slowing down like my feet were stuck in honey, staring at the monitor feed. The moth never moved, but it didn't need to. Its presence was enough. Its wings shimmered under the lights, the patterns of them twisting ever so slightly like they were alive. And those eyes, black, bottomless, seemed to pull you in if you looked too long. One night during a patrol, I heard them. Voices, low and urgent, coming from the storage room near Containment Wing C. I paused outside the door, my heart hammering, and listened. Henderson and Ramirez, their words muffled but clear enough to make out pieces of their conversation. "You felt it, haven't you?" Henderson was saying, his tone sharper than usual. "It's like it knows you're there," Ramirez replied, her voice tight, almost breathless. "And when you're close enough..." She cut herself off, her words breaking into a low laugh. It wasn't the kind of laugh I'd heard from her before. It was soft and warm, like she just told a joke only she understood. "Don't fight it," Henderson said. "You've seen Wilson. He's better, stronger. You will be too." I stepped back, careful not to let my boots scrape the floor. Even a tiny squeak threatened to reveal my location. My chest felt tight, my pulse thudding in my ears. I didn't know what they were talking about, not exactly, but it was enough to make me realize I wasn't imagining things. Something was happening. That night, I kept seeing them, Henderson and Ramirez, walking down that corridor in perfect step, their faces calm but unreadable. It wasn't just strange. It was wrong in a way I couldn't put into words. My mind kept circling back to Henderson's words. "You've seen Wilson. He's better, stronger. You will be too. Stronger." I've been trying to ignore it, but it was true. Wilson had changed. They all had. I kept replaying the moment he lifted that crate like it weighed nothing, the way his movements were so smooth, almost efficient. It wasn't normal. None of it was. By the time my next shift rolled around, I'd convinced myself to stay out of it. Whatever was going on, it wasn't my business. I'd seen what happened to people who dug too deep at Facility 112. You didn't get answers. You just disappeared. I told myself to focus on the routine, patrol the halls, check the monitors, and keep my head down. Nothing more. This is how it's always been. But it wasn't that easy. Not when the signs were everywhere. My next shift started at midnight, and by then, I was exhausted. The kind of tiredness that makes you jump at shadows and second-guess every sound. My patrol route was the same as always, down the main corridor, past the labs, and then a sweep of Containment Wing C. I'd started dreading that part of the route, but skipping it wasn't an option. The moth was always there, motionless behind the thick glass, its wings folded neatly against its massive body. It never moved, but the air in that corridor always felt heavier, like walking through water. A metallic tang was stronger there too, clinging to your skin long after you walked away. But tonight, something was different. I caught Wilson again in front of the observation window to Containment Wing C. He wasn't supposed to be there. His shift had ended hours ago. But there he was, staring into the chamber, like he was waiting for something. His hands were by his sides, fingers twitching slightly. I hesitated, watching him from the end of the hall. For a moment, I thought about calling out to him, but before I could, he turned and walked into the chamber, his steps quick and purposeful, as though he'd known I was there the whole time. I followed him. I shouldn't have, but something about the way he moved, so deliberate, so precise, drew me in. He didn't stop until he reached one of the storage rooms. The door clicked shut behind him, and I crept closer, staying in the shadows. The observation window for the moth's chamber came into view, and I froze. Inside, the lights were dim, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. Henderson, Ramirez, and Wilson were there, standing in a loose circle around the moth. His wings shimmered faintly under the low light, the patterns on them seeming to ripple as if they were alive. I should have turned back. I should have called it in, but I couldn't move. I stayed there, my breath caught in my chest, watching as Wilson stepped closer to the moth. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost graceful. He reached out, his hand brushing against the moth's thorax. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I saw it. A thick, golden drop of liquid welling up from the point where his hand made contact. It clung to his fingers like honey, glistening in the dim light. Wilson raised his hand to his mouth and drank. I bit down hard on my lip to keep from making a sound. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. Ramirez was next. She knelt before the moth, her head tilted back as she reached for another bead of that golden liquid. Her face was lit with something I could only describe as bliss. It made my stomach churn, and vomit threatened to crawl up into my mouth. Henderson went last. He didn't hesitate, didn't pause to think. He stepped forward, his movements smooth and practiced, as though he'd done this dozens of times before. When he drank, his body shuddered briefly, like a ripple passing through him, and then he straightened, his face eerily calm. They stayed there for a moment, silent, their heads slightly bowed. It was like watching a ritual, something sacred. The moth didn't move, didn't react. It just was, its stillness more commanding than any motion could have been. I stepped back slowly, my head spinning, my pulse racing, but I couldn't let them see me. If they knew I was there, I didn't want to think about what they'd do. Once I was far enough away, I turned and hurried back to the break room, my hand shaking. I kept seeing it. Wilson drinking from his fingers, Ramirez kneeling like she was in a prayer, Henderson's face as calm as stone. And the liquid, that golden, syrupy drop that seemed to glow in the light. I sat down, my mind racing. Whatever was happening in that room, it wasn't just them. The moth wasn't just sitting there. It was feeding them. And whatever it was giving them, it was changing them. I didn't know what to do. Reporting it felt useless. If the higher-ups didn't already know, they wouldn't believe me. And if they did, well, they'd probably just erase me, like they erased everything else that didn't fit. I glanced at the clock. It was just past 3 a.m. The rest of my shift dragged on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed the line, that there was no going back now. Whatever was happening in Containment Wing C, it wasn't going to stop. And part of me wasn't sure if I wanted it to. The next few days were unbearable. I couldn't look at Henderson, Ramirez, or Wilson without seeing them in that chamber, kneeling before the moth, their hands slick with that golden liquid. They weren't trying to hide it anymore. Not really. Wilson, who was hauling equipment meant for forklifts, his movements smooth and effortless. Ramirez had an intensity about her now. Her eyes were sharper and her reactions were faster. Henderson had taken on a strange authority, his voice steady and commanding, like he knew something the rest of us didn't. And the changes weren't just physical. They moved together now in unspoken coordination. No words, no signals, just a silent understanding that made my skin crawl. If one of them started walking, the other followed without hesitation. If one turned their head, the others seemed to already know what they were looking at. It was unnatural. The moth's chamber became the center of their world. They spent more time there, sometimes even during shifts they weren't scheduled for. No one questioned it. Maybe they didn't notice, or maybe they were too afraid to say anything. I couldn't blame them. I didn't want to talk about it either. But the thing that scared me the most was the way they started looking at me. It was subtle at first, a glance that lingered too long, a faint tilt of the head, like they were studying me. But then it became more obvious. Henderson would brush past me in the corridor, his eyes locking onto mine just long enough to make me break out in a cold sweat. Ramirez started showing up during my shifts, leaning against the wall near the observation window, watching me instead of the monitors. And Wilson smiled. Not the warm, easy smile he used to have, but something else. Something empty. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late to stop it. It was a little after midnight when the alarm went off. A low, droning sound that meant a breach in one of the containment chambers. I was halfway through my patrol when it started, the red emergency lights casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. My radio crackled, voices overlapping in the chaotic mess. Wing C compromised. Containment failure. I didn't need to hear the rest. I knew exactly where the breach was. The moth's chamber. I ran, my boots pounding against the floor, my chest tightening with every step. The corridor leading to Wing C was empty. No guards, no techs, no one responding to the alarm. The door to the moth's chamber was wide open, and the reinforced glass observation window shattered. And inside, Henderson, Ramirez, and Wilson were no longer themselves. Their bodies had changed, their limbs thicker, covered in a soft, dark fuzz that shimmered faintly under the emergency lights. Their eyes were black now, endless pools that reflected everything and nothing. And their movements, they weren't just coordinated. They were precise, mechanical, like parts of the same machine. The moth stood in the center of the chamber, its wings fully open for the first time. They were massive, filling the space with patterns that seemed to shift and ripple in a way that made my head ache just looking at them. Its long tongue extended, dripping that golden liquid, feeding into something at its feet. The cocoons. There were 3 of them, each the size of a person, wriggling faintly as the moth's tongue dipped more sap into the surfaces. The air in the room was thick, buzzing with an electric hum that made my skin crawl. I stepped back, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to do. Run, hide, report it. But before I could decide, Henderson's head snapped toward me, his black eyes locking onto mine. Ramirez and Wilson followed, their movements perfectly synchronized. For a moment, none of us moved. The only sound was the low hum of the moth's wings, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones. Then, Henderson smiled, the same empty, knowing smile Wilson had given me days before. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's not your time." I didn't wait to find out what he meant. I turned and ran, my legs burning as I sprinted down the corridor, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Behind me, I could hear their footsteps, perfectly in sync, echoing in the empty halls. I didn't stop until I reached the security room. I slammed the door shut, my hands fumbling with the lock, and turned to the monitor feeds. What I saw made my stomach drop. The cocoons were splitting open, thick strands of golden sap dripping onto the floor as something inside began to emerge. The moth loomed over them, its wings fluttering faintly, stirring the air in the chamber. One by one, the cocoons tore open, revealing creatures that were almost human. They had the same dark fuzz covering their bodies, their limbs elongated and strong, their black eyes shining like mirrors. They moved with a terrifying grace, stepping forward in unison, their heads tilting as they took in their surroundings. The moth moved for the first time, its wings spreading wide as it let out a low, resonant hum that shook the walls. The hybrids turned toward the sound, their heads bowing in perfect synchrony. The radio crackled to life, a panicked voice shouting orders I couldn't make out. The bigwigs must have seen what was happening because the chamber was flooded with gas a moment later. The hybrids didn't flinch. They turned toward the door, moving as one, and I realized with a sinking feeling that they still remembered the access codes. I stayed frozen in the security room for what felt like hours, staring at the monitors as everything spiraled out of control. The hybrids were everywhere now, moving through the facility like they built it themselves. They weren't rushing, weren't scrambling. No, they moved with purpose, room to room, hallway to hallway, methodically and terrifyingly precise. It was like they didn't even need to check. They already knew where everyone was. I could feel the air tightening around me. It wasn't just the hybrids or the alarms. It was the moth. Even from here, I could feel its presence pressing down like it was watching through the cameras, through the walls, through me. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely keep them steady on the console. I couldn't stay. The ICD would be sweeping through soon, probably trying to gas the whole damn place, hybrids or not. And if I stuck around, I'd either end up dead or with my memory scrambled, just another loose end tied off. I scanned the monitors, searching for anything, anywhere that wasn't crawling with hybrids or swarming with cleanup teams. That's when I noticed it. The maintenance tunnels. They were old, barely used, and not part of the standard patrol routes, yet untouched by the hybrids. I slipped out of the security room, my heart pounding in my chest. The corridors were bathed in that eerie red glow from the emergency lights, shadows flickering along the walls. My boots barely made a sound as I moved, but every little creak, every faint hum of the facility's systems made me flinch. I could feel my pulse in my throat, thick and heavy, drowning out everything else. The air was different down here. The facility's usual sterile tang was still there, but that metallic edge was stronger and sharper. It clung to everything. The walls, the floor, my skin. My head was spinning, my stomach churning, but I kept moving. The access ladder to maintenance level 3 was just ahead. When I reached it, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the cold metal rungs. Climbing down felt like stepping into a grave, but what choice did I have? I gripped the ladder tightly as I began my descent, the faint squeak of my boots on the rungs echoing in the shaft. Every sound felt too loud, like it was bouncing back to me tenfold. The maintenance tunnels were worse than I remembered, tight, damp and dark. My flashlight barely cut through the blackness, the beam wobbling as my hand shook. The air was thicker down here, heavy with the smell of rust and stagnant water, and the faint hum of the pipes sounded like whispers. The service hatch wasn't far, just at the end of the corridor, a faint sliver of moonlight visible through the cracks. I quickened my pace, my boots splashing through shallow puddles, the sound too loud in the oppressive silence. My breath was ragged now, every inhale sharp against my chest, but I kept my eyes locked on the hatch. I could see it, my way out, so close I could almost taste the fresh air waiting on the other side. Then, I heard it. A soft, clicking sound, faint at first, like nails tapping on metal. My flashlight swung wildly toward the noise, my beam catching on a shadow that shouldn't have been there. My stomach dropped as one of the hybrids stepped into the light. Its black, mirror-like eyes caught the beam, reflecting it back in a way that made my chest tighten. Its head tilted, slow and deliberate, like it was studying me, deciding what to do next. I didn't want to find out. I ran. The hatch was only a few feet away, but it felt like miles. The clicking behind me grew louder, faster, almost rhythmic, like it was matching the beat of my panicked footsteps. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't stop. I hit the hatch with full force, my hands fumbling for the release lever, my fingers slick with sweat. The hybrid was right behind me. I could feel it, its presence crawling up my spine like static electricity. With a desperate heave, I yanked the lever. The hatch swung open, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I scrambled through, hitting the ground hard, my palms scraping against the rough dirt. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I twisted around and slammed the hatch shut, twisting the emergency lock into place just as something heavy slammed against the other side. The metal groaned, the hatch vibrating under the force of the hybrid's blows. I stumbled back, my legs barely holding me up, and turned toward the forest. The trees loomed like shadows, the branches clawing at the sky, the moonlight barely breaking through the dense canopy. I didn't wait. I didn't think. I just ran.